In the second section of their essay, W.B. defined the intentional fallacy as a romantic one. Why? Because the legacy of Romanticism is one that tends to equate the power of a poem with the power or intensity of a poet's subjective experience. The beautiful, W.B. ventriloquize, is the successful intuition expression, and the ugly is the unsuccessful. End quote. Here they take the writings of Benedetto Croce, an Italian literary critic and philosopher who confusingly defines and practices a mode of historical interpretation that sets out to reconstruct the psychological conditions under which the poem was constructed, so that we might, quote, see a work of art, and this is Croce, as the author saw it in the moment of production, end quote. In their survey of Croce's work and the work of other critics, many of whom are alien to us now in 2014, WB simply want to point out that the construction of how authors and their contemporaries see can certainly be taken up in, quote, sociology, biography, or other kinds of non-aesthetic history, end quote, but that these modes of research, right, do not in any way manage to account for the workings of the poem as a literary object, as a whole, quote, that may be publicly tested, end quote, here and now. With this phrasing, publicly tested, in mind, we can make more sense of the division between public and private, the division between public and private, that W.B. make in the first section. The importance of tying the possession of a poem to the public and not to the critic or to the author is a way of setting up a system of peer review for what might otherwise be taken as a purely subjective or, as they see it, romantic exercise. I should just note that their comments about romanticism would probably be refuted by most romantic scholars now, but they are invoking a rather traditional understanding of what romanticism is. Anyway, a new critic influenced by the ideas of W.B. Does not just write up his or her own thoughts about a poem, but attempts to construct a careful interpretation that will hopefully resonate with as many readers as possible, making it as objective as possible, and that will be incorrect if too many readers or too many other critics fail to recognize their own understanding in that of the critic. A poem is public. Instead of laboring through W.B.'s survey of various contemporaries, the survey which really doesn't contain much in the way of specific refutation, it's worth, I think, jumping to the third section of their essay. Here they take on the writings of poets themselves, that is, writings about poetry by poets. Should not these writings, for example, Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads, be taken as some sort of standard of literary criticism? Discourse straight from the practitioners of the art themselves. Quote, certainly the poets have something to say that the analyst and professor could not say, our co-authors concede. However, if we attend to the writings of a Wordsworth or a Carlyle on the writing of poetry, we see something very different from what W.B. want to call objective aesthetic criticism. One observes, rather, the rather elegant, quote, art of inspiring other poets, or at least of inciting something like poetry in younger persons, end quote. To track down or identify moments of inspiration, or to account for the psychology of composition, are no doubt interesting scholarly activities, W.B. admit. But again, they fail to account for those things that matter to the literary critic. In their words, integrity, relevance, unity, function, maturity, subtlety, and adequacy. W.B. do not deny that there is some sort of expressing its own feelings or desires or meanings at the origin point of specific poems or novels. They don't really talk about novels. But, citing and challenging Kurt Dukas, they point out that this self-expression would not matter to us if it were not simultaneously an act of objective depersonalizing of a kind of objective depersonalization of feeling, right? Some sort of making public of a complex feeling that others can also feel. Quote, the evaluation of the work of art, they insist, remains public, end quote, despite the volumes of subjective writings on the writing of poetry itself. Quote, the work is measured against something outside the author, end quote. In the fourth section, WB pushed their distinction between public and private even further, distinguishing criticism of poetry from what they call author psychology. The first, criticism, requires what they call internal evidence. The latter, external evidence. The first, criticism, focuses on the verbal, public, semantic, syntactical, quote, habitual knowledge of language, end quote. Habitual for all practitioners of that language. It requires only a sense of grammar, and at most, access to dictionaries. The latter, that is, author psychology, seeks out private, idiosyncratic material, revelations in private letters, anecdotes from the author's friends or acquaintances, or even, some sort of account of biographical events recorded by someone else. Well, there might be a way to use such evidence in non-intentionalistic ways, tracking, W.B. Wright, one author's use of the same word or phrase across several works or across their diaries or letters in order to understand its appearance in a single poem or extended work of literature. The latter external sort of evidence can often mislead a critic who does not pay enough attention to the internal verbal evidence of the poem itself. As an example, they point to Charles M. Coffin's 1927 work on John Donne, right? A monograph on John Donne. Coffin makes a historical link between the imagery of Donne's seminal poem, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, and contemporary advancements in astronomy at his time, particularly those made by Kepler, Galileo, Gilbert, and Clavius. Though it is difficult to answer such a learned argument, WB admit, quote, the text itself, right, its figurative layers, remains to be dealt with, end quote. When we attend directly to the poem, they argue, it makes little sense to see its allusions to the movement of bodies as a connection to an understanding of solar bodies, when all that seems to be alluded to is simply an earthquake, especially when the poem makes analogies between the expressions of pain and loss and other disasters, delimited to the earth itself, tear floods and sigh tempests. And did even the tense of Donne's verbs suggests that he is alluding to the movements of the earth that are over and done with, like those of a natural disaster, rather than to celestial movements, right? The revolution of solar bodies, which would be continuous and ongoing. Quote, to make the geocentric and heliocentric antithesis the core of the metaphor, W.B. Wright, is to disregard the English language and to prefer private evidence of what Donne knew about astronomy to the public operation of language and meaning itself. Paraphrasing some of the end of that quote. In the final section, Wimsatt and Beardsley's of their article, they focus on the problem of living poets and poetic allusiveness, that is, the way in which poets refer directly in their poems to other and earlier works of literature. It makes sense, after all, to do away with a concern for intention in the case of Shakespeare, since we would never be able to test out a claim about what his design was when writing The Tempest, right? Since there's not really any archival evidence to suggest to us what was going on in his mind when he was writing that. But certainly in the case of someone like T.S. Eliot, who was very much alive in 1946 when this article was written, one could simply settle matters, couldn't they, by, quote, consulting the oracle himself? According to W.B., the treatment of living authors as sovereigns over their own texts, as directors of where critics should look for the answers to their riddles, robs critical inquiry of its criticality and of any hope for objectivity. But what of the modernist trend of allusiveness, the tendency to make self-conscious allusions to earlier poems or earlier works, not all of them poems? Quote, "The frequency and depth of literary allusion in the poetry of Eliot and others," W.B. Wright, "has driven so many critics in pursuit of full meanings to the Golden Bough and the Elizabethan drama, that it has become commonplace to suppose that we do not know what a poet means unless we have traced him in his readings." End quote. In other words, and this is often still the case, when one is studying a writer as complicated as Eliot, who makes so many allusions in his poetry to other poets, there's a tendency to conflate the work of interpretation with the work of sort of scavenger hunting, right? Of tracking down where he took this line from and where he took that line from, and then really not thinking through the implications of that. That simply finding and making those connections is a substitute for the work of criticism. That's what W.B. are referring to here. So whether or not we directly consult Eliot, there is a tendency, in other words, to equate the meaning of a difficult work of literature, this is what I was just sort of off the cuff trying to restate, with the reading history of the author, him or herself. We often see this in the case of theoretical and philosophical texts, too. In fact, I just saw a funny video a few years ago about this, right? Someone admits that they're reading Derrida, and the person responds, "Oh, that's nice, but you'll never understand what he means unless you read Heidegger and Hegel and Kant and Descartes and, right, into a sort of infinite regression all the way back to Plato and the pre-Socratics, right? In the context of literary study, W.B. claim, this also constitutes an intentional fallacy. So what do we do about literary texts that cite other literary texts? What about moments where it's difficult to tell if a text is alluding to another text? W.B. do not really offer any answers to these problems, it seems to me, though they do survey some positions in regard to Eliot's notes on the wasteland, which are usually included with the poem, no matter what edition you get. All they do is simply insist that these problems, the problems of the living author, the problems of the author's commentary on his or her own work, are not solved by consulting the author, Eliot or some other living poet, as the standard of a reading. Pointing out or establishing a link between Eliot and Donne, for instance, or looking to Eliot himself for approval, for the approval of this link, tells us nothing or next to nothing about what the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, for instance, might mean. If all that matters is that it alludes to other poetry, then perhaps the poem is not really worth preserving, since it's incomplete. Perhaps on its own terms, it isn't a successful poem. Anyone who knows me knows I don't feel that way about Eliot, but W.B. simply sort of proposed that idea. If in order for a poem to be successful, we need to track down an earlier poem in order to understand it, they're simply pointing out that perhaps that's an indication that it may not be successful, that in some sense it still needs to stand up on its own. So anyway, we come back to the issue of Rowling then, don't we? Should we care about what she says about Dumbledore or about Harry and Hermione? The answer we get from Wimsatt and Beardsley is a little unsatisfactory. It depends, right, they would say. If you're concerned with author psychology, or concerned with author biography, or concerned with the sociology of literary reading, then by all means, right, fold in Rowling's comments. But if one is attempting to judge whether or not the Harry Potter novels themselves are successfully literary, something I can't judge, I've never actually read them, then really it's probably worth bracketing out what she thinks. So that's the intentional fallacy. Anyway, in my next video, I want to offer a few comments about WB's argument, namely where I think it succeeds, where I think it is doing something that should still be interesting to us now, whether we're literary or cultural critics, or whether we're just common readers interested in engaging in written works, and where I think it fails to offer a robust account of literature, literary meaning, and the link between a life and an oeuvre. Okay.